GM Inga Beale. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Dean. And I want to start with a question for everyone. I want to say or ask, how many times have you felt you didn't belong somewhere? How often are you or were you in a situation where you feel like or felt like the excluded one, the different one, the odd one out? Well, for me, that actually started quite early in life. I grew up in Newbury, small market town, 60 miles west of London, actually in a happy family. But I was the middle child, so already maybe I had some problems. But the important thing for me at that time was that my brother and sister were born with white blonde hair. I was born with dark brown hair. Now, you'd say, well, why does that matter? Well, it mattered to me because my brother and sister told me I was adopted because I looked different to them. And as I said, this was from a very early age, 5, 6, 7 years old. And my brother and sister became great friends and they played together all the time. And I felt like the odd one out. Despite everything my parents said to me about I wasn't adopted and they gave me all the love they could, I still felt like the odd one out. And that feeling of not being included in the gang, that very early feeling probably helped me gain the independent streak that's actually been an important part of how my life has been shaped over the years. Because I used to play on my own, I used to be very independent, go on long cycle rides on my own, even from when I was a little girl. But we know, of course, that not feeling included, particularly in the workplace, is not a good thing. It's not good for an individual, and it's certainly not good for business. Now, I started working quite a while ago in the city of London in the 80s. 1982 was the first time I got a job. And I wasn't actually focused on my career at all at that stage. I was working in a very male-dominated environment. It was in the insurance sector. And I, to fit in, became one of the lads. I so didn't want to be different to them. I wanted to be one of them. So in the office environment, I kind of took on male behaviors and I just wanted to be like the men. I wanted to be accepted. And of course, I wasn't ever really fully accepted like that, but I also had an escape valve. I had sport. And what was more important for me in those early days of working in the city was that I could leave the office each evening and get down to the River Thames, right in the heart of London, and get out on the water with my rowing crew, because we had daily training sessions. And then a few years later, I started playing rugby, quite a high level. I played for Wasp Rugby Club. I played there for 12 years. And I think it was the sports that actually gave me a feeling of belonging, because it was naturally very inclusive that you were part of the team. So I had a very important support network outside of work, which I think was my savior. It kept me going. Now, I did get to the top of the insurance profession, but insurance very nearly lost me when I was in my late 20s after a sexist incident at my employer. I said I was working in a very male-dominated environment, and I was 27 years old, and I arrived at work one morning to find my workstation wrapped up like a goddamn present in posters of scantily clad women. Well, this was the late 80s, so there were a lot of posters like that around. I was so mad, I walked out of the office. I didn't speak to anyone. I just went home completely disillusioned with the whole industry. I gave up my job and promised myself I'd never work in insurance again. I decided to go traveling around the world, the best decision I ever made. I traveled for about a year in total, and I learned about the power of role models, because being in London at that time in insurance, there were no senior women, no female role models. But after some months of traveling through Asia, I got to Australia, I got to Sydney, and then I needed some money because I hadn't exactly planned this trip. And I got a job at the BBC in Sydney. Now, in this office, the manager was a woman, and I was like, wow, the most senior person in this office is a woman. And she acted completely naturally. She wasn't trying to be a guy. She wasn't trying to be a man. She wasn't trying to be anything that she wasn't. And she had a huge impact on me. And that was the first time I realized the importance of having a role model. And the older I've gotten, the more I've gone through my career, I realize the importance of role models. Now, after my travels, I was back in the London insurance market, And another phase of my life started, because I did actually accept my old job back when my employer heard I was back. But I was this time doing it on my terms. But I had another phase starting because I started to date women. And up until that time, I'd been a heterosexual woman as far as I was concerned. So here I was now having a lesbian chapter. And I made all sorts of sacrifices during that time because I wasn't out. I decided I was working in this very male environment. There was no way I was going to come out about my sexuality. So for many years, I was in the closet. And my partner, who was with me for many, many years, she moved to the US with me. She moved to Germany with me. She moved to France, to Switzerland. And always she was secret in the background. My employer never knew that I was gay. So that was happening for many, many, many years. Now, I did come out eventually in 2007, and there was a whole story behind that because I'd gone through a huge trauma at work. I was the CEO of a company. We'd had a hostile takeover. I was under a lot of pressure for months. And it wasn't actually the pressure. It was after the pressure was over. And one of my exec team came to me and said, Inga, how did you cope? How did you cope on your own through all that time? And I suddenly thought, wow, I've been lying to all these people. They've been feeling sorry for me because they think I'm on my own. I said, enough is enough. What have I done to myself? What have I done to my partner? And I said, from that moment on, the next job interview I go for, I'm going to come out. And I did. In the first 5 minutes of that next job interview, I got the job and I felt wonderful. It released a whole energy in me that I'd never had before. But then a few years on, and I have had various phases to my life. I suppose I start off feeling the odd one out at home. I go through being a heterosexual woman fighting in a man's world in the 80s. I then become this sort of roving feminist traveling the world to becoming a lesbian. And then what happens? After 12 years, my wife at the time chose to leave me for a younger woman. And I found myself in a relationship with a man again. Now, this was in 2013. So then I got a new label, bisexual. And then another type of exclusion happened. The lesbians didn't want me around anymore because I was now with a man. So I know what it's like through various stages of my life to be in the gang, out of the gang. But when I arrived at Lloyd's, I realized that I needed to now really be a brave role model around this stuff. Because I arrived to a very old institution which had very little diversity. And I knew we had to change if we were going to survive into the modern world. So I thought, what am I going to do about this? I started talking about it, employee town halls. I started talking about the lack of women in senior roles. I started looking out at a sea of white faces. I started using words like gay, lesbian, and bisexual. And I tell you, there were, first of all, some giggles, perhaps heads bowed in slight embarrassment, but I didn't stop. And our employees started to feel empowered. They felt empowered. They started networks and groups, employee resource groups. And I remember particularly the launch of our Pride at Lloyd's group, our LGBT network. We launched it one evening. We had some speeches. It was a celebration. And one of the men who was there, an older guy, had been working at Lloyd's for about 30 years. He came up to me and he had a slight tear in his eye. And he said, Inga, thank you. I never thought I would see this happen in Lloyd's. I never thought I would see this day. This is quite amazing. I thought he was going to tell me he'd come out of the closet for the first time after 30 years at work. But instead, he told me that his son was gay. And for years, he'd not felt able to talk about it openly at work. Perhaps for fear of some nasty banter in the office, criticism, whatever it was, some judgment that people were going to make. I was delighted that he'd now come out about his son. And it shows the power of what you can do through employee resource groups or having an inclusive workplace. It can liberate and empower individuals, and sometimes in ways that we might not have expected. Now, obviously, an organization's culture is a direct reflection of its leadership, and I was able to do all sorts of things. But there's also stuff from an individual perspective that can be done. And every single one of us every day can be a role model in some way. We can influence and make change happen, speak up when we think there's some inappropriate behavior being displayed or something feels wrong. So people can have huge influence. I want to be able to use mine, and I want to be able to continue to be outspoken. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back to Dean.